Hello and welcome to this GCSE AQA psychology revision video on the social influence topic. So we're going to go through the topic hopefully fairly quickly, just as a recap before your exams in the summer. So let's get on with it. Okay, so the first part of the topic is conformity. The topic looks at conformity, obedience, pro-social behaviour and group and collective behaviour. So looking at conformity then, well, what is it? You've got a definition there. It's a change in behaviour or belief as a result of a real or imagined group pressure. So think of this in your own life. You must have come across it, either yourself or friends or family, where someone has changed what they think or the way that they act based on what a group of people are doing. At the GCSE, you don't necessarily need to look into lots of detail about why this may be. At A level, you do. So at A level, you start looking at things like normative social influence. So that says that people change their behaviour, change the way they think because they want to fit in with the group. So this will be your classic, I don't know, recording videos on Reels or TikTok, you know, your fireball. And people are doing that because they feel like they want to fit in with other people, their peers, similar to them. The other type of social influence is informational social influence. So this is where you feel that other people have got more information than you have. So if you see someone running and screaming, you might want to follow them because you might think, oh, they know something I don't. They know about the fire or the bomb or whatever it may be happening behind them, and so you follow that information. As I say, that's more in the A level. It might be quite helpful for the GCSE as a bit of an understanding. But what you do need to know here is the first named study in the social topics, and that is the Ash line study. So Solomon Ash, really famous study. It comes up time and time again in psychology, but other areas of study as well. And this is where Ash was looking at how people react to group pressure. So you put someone in a situation where there's a group of people giving information. Do people respond to that? Do people change their thoughts or their behavior based on what the group are doing? Ash did this with what he called an unambiguous stimuli. So there's some information where the correct answer should be quite obvious. And what happens if people are giving the incorrect answer? Does that change people's opinion? So that's what he did there. So that was the aim. The method, how did he do it? So there was 123 male participants. This was done in the United States. And what happened was there was a group of 7 people in a room. 6 of those people were Confederates. So if you don't know what a Confederate is, it's someone that's working for the researcher. The real participant doesn't know that. So the real participant thinks everyone else in the room is in the same position that they're in, that they've just been recruited to this study, whereas in fact the other 6 are giving answers that the researcher has told them to. So Ash placed this group in a line. The real participant was placed number 6 in the line. So you had 5 people before them, 1 person after them. And what they were asked to do is give an answer to an unambiguous stimuli. So this stimuli that he gave were lines. There was a target line, and then there were 3 lines that they had to look at and say, did the target line match the other 3 lines? And it should be fairly obvious what the answer is on that. And there were varying lengths of these lines. It was different each time. And there were 18 trials, so 18 times this happened. And on the early trials, early on, Ash told the Confederates to give the right answer, because obviously if the Confederates were given the wrong answer all the time, then the participant might just think, oh, well, they don't understand it, they can't see it properly, there's something wrong with them. But actually, by getting the Confederates to give the correct answer to begin with, it made the participant trust them maybe a bit more, trust their judgment, and see what they did. On 12 of these trials, these were known as the critical trials. So these were the ones where they selected the wrong answer. So it was meant to be obvious. Let's have a look. So in a second, let's look at what the lines look like. Okay, so these were the lines, these were the unambiguous lines, so it should be fairly obvious that line B is most closely matched to the target line, X. And so on the original trials, the participants would say, yeah, X, B, fine. But on these 12 critical trials, the Confederates were giving the wrong answer. And saying, oh, it's A or C or whatever the combination was on the lines on those trials. As I say, it changed trial by trial what the lengths of the lines, but it was always fairly obvious what the correct answer was. So Ash was interested in seeing, well, what effect does this have on people? So let's look at the results. Okay, so the results were, drum roll, Latest drum roll ever. The results were 36.8% of the time the participants gave the wrong answer. So although the stimulus was unambiguous, people were giving incorrect answers. So that's quite interesting. What they also found was that 25% of the participants never gave the wrong answer. They always gave the right answer. So that shows that the line was unambiguous. People can give the right answer. It also shows some people are able to resist the pressures to conform. So in this study, a quarter of the participants didn't conform. However, the vast majority did. So 75% of the participants conformed at least once. So this group behavior seems to have an effect on individuals' thinking, behaviour, the way that they gave the answer. And then there were some participants who conformed the whole time. So there does seem to be some variability, and we'll look at that. What is it about individuals or the situation that makes some people more or less likely to conform? But there does seem to be a good amount of conformity there. So that's our conclusion. People do conform to group pressure, even when there's an obvious answer. Conformity has an effect. We are influenced by the people around us. However, there's variability in there. So some are more influenced than others, and we can look at why that might be the case. Okay, so looking at evaluations then, as this is a revision video, I'm not going to go over this in loads of detail. You're more than welcome to pause and take notes if you want to, but just to give you a bit of a flavour of how we can evaluate it. Now, there are 3 weaknesses here. It doesn't mean it was an awful study, but it does mean that when you're looking at this in an exam and for this course, these are maybe some of the more interesting points to talk about. And there are weaknesses here, of course there are. So the first one being that the situation was quite artificial. So that impacts the validity, the external validity. Can we use these results in the real world? Well, how often, other than before you've heard about this study, are you asked to judge the length of lines? I mean, some people might be, but in everyday, day-to-day situations, that's not a usual task. So they're using an artificial stimulus, and so people might react differently when it's things that matter. You know, judging a line length, they might think, well, it doesn't matter if someone said something and I'm going to say something different. There's no consequence there. Whereas if it's a life and death situation, if it's something that might affect, I don't know, pay or whether they pass a test or something like that, it might have changed their results. So don't forget, when you're looking at evaluations, use the PEC, and that's how I've laid those out here. The other issue here is we can question the temporal validity. So Ash's studies, there were a series of them, happened in the 1950s in America. Now that is a particular time. So the 1950s in America, there's a phrase called McCarthyism. It was quite conformist in general. So it was during a time where it didn't pay to be different to the group. You had people being accused of being communists, and so actually you wanted to go along with the group. So would that be the same now? Who knows? And this was replicated. This has been replicated in different places. So Perrin and Spence replicated this study in the 1980s in the UK and found a lot lower levels of conformity. So you could suggest that it was kind of a child of its time. The results that were found, those high results, were found only because of the situation at the time. So that's known as temporal validity, temporal linking to time. So it was only found at that time. And then finally, culture could have an effect here. So it was done in the US. The US, UK, Western cultures tend to be quite what we call individualistic. So it's all about the individual, all about what the individual can do, all about how the individual can get by and better themselves. Whereas if you compare that to something like collectivist cultures, so maybe more Eastern cultures, that's not individualistic, it's collectivist. So that's where the group is more important, and that might change where the culture you're in might change whether people conform or not. So that's going to have an impact. And there, Smith and Bond conducted a review of those sorts of studies and found higher conformity in these conformist groups. Next up, then, we look at reasons why people might conform and explanations for them. So first off, we look at social factors, which are things about the environment. And then we go on to looking at dispositional factors, which are things about the individual, so personality type things. You'll see this as a bit of a pattern across this topic. So for each of the areas, obedience, conformity, pro-social behaviour, collective and group behaviour, you then need to try to explain those using social and dispositional factors. Some overlap, some are slightly different, so just be careful making sure you know which relates to which area. So these are social factors that affect conformity. And firstly, group size is a big one. So there needs to be a certain number of people. So it's thought 3 is the magic number. So if your group is smaller than 3, if you've got 1 or 2 people, it's probably not going to change people's mind. If there's 3, that's good. That's enough people giving a certain answer to make other people maybe question their own answers, change their behaviour, change their thinking. There can be too many. So there can be, I think it's around 15, 12, 15. If there's too many, you think there's collusion. So what collusion means is kind of scheming. People have got together to try to get at you. So that kind of sweet spot between 3 and about 12, that's enough to change people's opinion. We'll evaluate each of these. So obviously group size can have an effect, but it might not. So it might vary depending on what you're being asked to look at. So if it was music preference, people's music preferences are probably going to be unlikely to be changed. You're not suddenly going to go from loving your T Swift to loving a bit of jazz just because other people are saying that that's what you should like. But maybe if it is something like line lengths, which you don't know a great deal about, or a maths problem that you're uncomfortable with, again, we'll talk about that a bit later on, then that might change it. So the task that you're being asked to do will probably interact with the group size to affect whether you change your behaviour or not. Next, anonymity. So whether you're anonymous or not might change how you act and behave. So in Ash's study, the one I described, people weren't anonymous. They had to give their answer in front of everyone else, having already heard other people's incorrect answer. So there's a bit more pressure there to go along with the group, because everyone knows you might be worried about what they think, they might be looking at you. Ash conducted the study, redid the study, but this time there was a condition where people could be anonymous, so they would write their answers down rather than speaking them out. When that was done, the level of conformity dropped. So anonymity could increase, anonymity decreases conformity, anonymity increases independent behaviour. So conformity tends to rely on this group pressure, bigger group size, but also having to do it in front of other people. That seems to be the thing that changes the behaviour. And so that might have an effect. Again, not always going to be the case. So if people are giving opinions in friends or with family, then anonymity might increase conformity rather than decrease it. You might kind of know what your friends are thinking and family are thinking. So it's a difficult one, but it's another social factor. It's something to do with the environment, whether it's anonymous or not, which might determine whether people conform. And finally, task difficulty. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. So if the task is difficult, then that might increase conformity. So Ash intentionally did an unambiguous task, an easier task, yet still found a fair bit of conformity. If the task is harder, then actually potentially your conformity might increase. So decreasing clarity or increasing difficulty increases the levels of conformity. That won't always be the case though, and actually if you're an expert in an area, as we'll see in a second, that then might decrease the levels of conformity. But those three things, those three social factors, how big the group is, whether you're giving an answer anonymously or not, and how difficult the task is, could affect how likely you are to conform. Okay, so the dispositional factors, this is factors about the individual, so personality factors potentially. So that's the first one, so personality. So there's something called locus of control. Locus of control. So what a locus of control is how control you feel over your life and things that are happening in and around you. So if you've got an internal locus of control, you feel you are responsible. It's all about you. You can determine the things that you do in your life. and it rests with you. If you've got an external locus of control, you feel that things happen to you, other things, other influences are impacting what you do in your life, and what's happening to you. So if we apply that to conformity, you can kind of see then that someone who has an internal locus of control, they feel they are in control of their lives, well, they might be less likely to conform. Whereas someone who thinks the external world, the environment around them, other things that are happening, so they've got an external locus of control, they're probably then more likely to conform. And that's what was found. So Berger and Cooper, participants with an external locus of control more likely to be influenced by Confederates' rating of a cartoon than those with internal locus of control. So if your locus of control is in the outside world, external locus of control, you're more likely to conform. If you believe you've got more control, less likely to conform. Should make sense. Again, there's a bit of evaluation there. It's not always found. Rotter has researched in this area a fair bit, and actually found that if you're in a situation that you're really comfortable with, then your locus of control doesn't change it. Whereas if you're in a new situation, that's when locus of control has an impact. So the external people more likely to conform, internal less likely. So personality is a dispositional factor that can influence conformity. And as I mentioned on the last slide, expertise as well. So depending on what the task is, if you're seen as an expert in that area, if you're a lot more confident in that area, then you might be less likely to conform. So I've seen examples that have done the ASH study with the lines done with architects or people involved in the construction industry, where actually they might have to measure line lengths, and they were a lot less likely to conform. Another study here, Lucas et al. Looked at maths equations, gave people maths equations, and if people rated themselves beforehand as good at maths, they were less likely to conform in the maths equation. If they didn't like maths, then they would go along with what the group was doing, and that makes a lot of sense as well. So that's both of these, personality, locus of control, and expertise, are to do with the individual and the aspects the individual are bringing to the situation, whether they would conform or not. Okay, so where conformity is doing things due to real or imagined group pressure, change in behavior or beliefs, obedience is different. Obedience is a direct instruction. So do people do what people directly tell them to do? Now, there are areas you need to look at here, and you need to be aware of Milgram's theories around this. So Milgram's study is a really famous one in psychology, but it's not actually necessarily mentioned on the spec. You won't get a direct question on this study like you would Ash's, because it is named, and Pilyarvin, as we'll look at in a moment. They are named studies. The Milgram study is not a named study, but it does help to know what this study is, because it helps you understand Milgram's theories. So what did Milgram do? Milgram family of refugees after World War II, and wanted to know why did the Nazi party, why did the people in the party do what their commanders were telling them to do? Were German people at the time just evil, or was it something to do with the environment around them? Were they just following orders, which is what lots of them claimed in the war crimes trials? So do people do what they're told to? That was the aim. Will people give electric shocks to people that are lethal just if they're told to do so? Now, so that was the aim. Obviously, if you were to do that as an actual study, not cool. Psychology wouldn't allow you to do that. The ethics, bit dubious there, so couldn't actually do that. So what they had to do is make people think they were doing that. So they recruited participants, 40 participants volunteered to take part. They thought they were doing a memory study. So if we start looking at ethics, there's already a bit of deception there. This happened at Yale University, a really prestigious university in America, and that might have an impact in a moment, because actually does where this takes place have an impact on whether people will obey to it or not. So yeah, participants went into the study again. They thought that they could be either a learner or a teacher. Again, there was a Confederate, so someone working for the researcher, and it was rigged to make sure that the Confederate was always the learner and the real participant got given the role of the teacher. So what the teacher was told to do was ask the learner some questions, and if they got the answer wrong, they had to let them know it was wrong and then give them a short electric shock. And each time they got it wrong, they would then increase the voltage up to 450 volts, which would be a lethal electric shock. They were given a slight shock to show what it might be like. They were they were shown the learner being hooked up to the machine, but what actually happened was they then went to another room. The learner wasn't hooked up to a machine, they weren't giving real shocks, and the learner's responses were played over a video. That was a control, so every participant heard the same responses. So when we start talking about your research methods here, which if you're thinking about the exam, you can get questions on, obviously this isn't a name study, but on most studies, on the name study certainly, you can get questions on the research methods used. But that was a control in this study. And so the method was to see, okay, well, did the participants give these shocks? How far did they go with it? And what they found was that most participants did go with it. So no participant stopped before 300 volts. That's quite a shock. And 65% of the participants continued to the full amount. So lots of people here obeyed. They did what they were told to do, and they shocked these people. There was someone in a white coat in the experiment, and if the participants gave any indication that they were uncomfortable and said, oh, should I be doing this, are they being hurt, they were told to continue. So that was kind of part of the obedience side of things. There was also some qualitative data collected. So participants did show signs of distress. It's not like they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't uncomfortable with it. They were uncomfortable with it, but they still did it, and that was the main thing. So what can we conclude? Yeah, people do seem to do what people are telling them to do. Certainly, if they are an experimenter in a lab coat in a prestigious university, and this is why, and this is what Milgram was after. Was it to do with the German people, or was it to do with the environment? Well, it looks like it was to do with the environment. So when in certain situations, in certain environments, so when it was a well-respected university, when they felt compelled to complete the task, when the situation, they didn't feel like they had any people to go, to help them and check whether they should be doing this with, that was an environment, a situation where people did obey. Okay, so now you know the study, you can start understanding Milgram's theories a bit more, and that's what you do need to know. So you need to know about Milgram's agency theory. So what does agency mean? It means, are you acting as an agent? So think of a travel agent, think of an estate agent, someone acting on behalf of someone else. So this is what Milgram said, is that actually the people in the experiment, and potentially Nazi Germany and other situations, the reason that they do what other people are doing, the reason they obey, the reason for obedience, is that they feel like they are acting on behalf of someone else. And so if you feel like you're acting on behalf of someone else, it means it's someone else's responsibility for what happens. The outcome isn't your responsibility. So this kind of agency theory is saying that, yeah, the reason people obey is because they feel like they're acting for someone else. Milgram said we could be in one of two states. We could be in an agentic state, where you do believe that you're acting for someone else, you're following orders, and you're feeling that they're having responsibility. Or you can be what's known as an autonomous state. So you feel like you've got control over your environment, you've got control over what you're doing, and actually any outcomes are your then responsibility. You're far more independent in an autonomous state. So continuing on from that, agency theory is a social factor. It's something to do with the environment, and authority has a big role to play here. So why would we act on behalf of someone else? Well, if that person is seen to have authority, then we might be more willing to act on their behalf. So this is the lab coat. It seemed like a legitimate researcher in the study. It was at Yale University. It's really prestigious. Obviously Yale wouldn't get them to do something dodgy, would they? No, clearly not. And so what Milgram was saying is authority has a big role to play here, and that change from being in an autonomous state, so autonomous, you think you're controlling it, it's your responsibility, to being in an agentic state where you're acting on behalf of someone else. It's known as an agentic shift. So you shift from thinking it's your responsibility to thinking it's someone else's. And a key part of that agentic shift is having an authority figure. So someone who believes, who you believe, or who that person believes has power, has a position in society, who the hierarchy, we'll come to hierarchy in a second, has determined as being having authority. Proximity is another thing that has an impact here. So there were variations of the Milgram study done where, so in the original, you had the learner in one room, the teacher in another, they could only hear them, they couldn't see them, etc. They did other examples here where they got the learner to be in the same room as the teacher. They did another one where they actually got the teacher to have to press down the learner's hand, and they in fact being shocked. And in these scenarios where the proximity, so closeness of the teacher and learner happened, the obedience decreased. So actually proximity has a role to play in obedience. And again, think about that real world application here. Think about World War II, you think about the concentration camps. Why was it that there wasn't, okay, originally the Nazi Party were face to face and were having to face up to it, but there's a reason why it ended up going to gas chambers where it was very much more, inhumane, and there wasn't that personal connection because the proximity, it increased the proximity. So decreased the proximity. They got further away, and so that increased the obedience. So yeah, it's this kind of, they called it moral strain. The closer you are to someone, the more moral strain there is, and so that makes individuals feel more responsible. Again, these are all social factors. And finally, culture. So mentioned hierarchy. Cultures where there's hierarchical structure, so you've got someone in power and then the next level. So think about schools, things like that. You've got a head teacher, you've got deputy heads, you've got teachers, you've got pupils, etc. Prisons could be the same, army ranks could be the same. So where you've got hierarchical structure, social hierarchy, that culture tends to breed more obedience, or so the schools hope, I guess. To clarify, I was not equating school to Nazi Germany. Okay, so looking at the evaluations then, similarly, I'm not going to go through these in loads of detail. You can pause, you can take notes if you want to, but you do need to know how to evaluate, and you can use the PEC. So firstly, there is research support for these explanations. And so after the study, students were shown videos of the experiment of the Milgram study and asked who was responsible for the outcomes here, and the students said that it was the experimenter, not the teacher, not the real participant. So that backs up this theory that that there is responsibility, this agentic shift, to the experimenter. However, these social factors aren't can't completely explain everything. So there were people that went against the Nazi Party. There are people that don't obey, yet the environment is the same. So we can't just say it's environmental factors. There must be individual factors in there as well, because excuse me, because otherwise everyone would do it. So there's got to be a balance here between social and dispositional factors. And finally, again, as I said, it was used in war crime trials, Nuremberg trials, I think it was, and they said that I was just following orders. Well, that's not good enough. You need to take responsibility for your own actions. Okay, as I said, usually there are two different explanations then for these things, whether it's conformity or obedience. So we've just looked at the social explanation for obedience. So now look at the dispositionals, the personality, the individual. What is it about individuals? There are some individuals that will be more likely to obey than others, and what is it about them? So first, this kind of, this personality. So some people are thought to have what's known as an authoritarian personality. And an authoritarian personality is someone who's more likely to be obedient. They often tend to be more prejudiced, so they have views about other people. They put other people down. They really believe in these hierarchies. They tend to have these really rigid beliefs. This is how things are. It can't be any other way. They quite conventional values, quite traditionalist, I guess. Hostility towards other groups. They believe in an in-group and an out-group, whether that is from different countries, from different races, from different religions, from different beliefs. That they believe that their view is right and that others are wrong. They tend to be quite submissive towards authority figures. They really believe in this hierarchy. They believe people at the top are to be obeyed and listened to completely, and people lower down not so much. And they've got this intolerance of ambiguity. So they don't like things have to be black and white. It's right or wrong. Can't be kind of, okay, well, I understand their point of view, but there's a different point of view. No, it's this way or it's that way. And they've got what's known as this rigid cognitive style. So cognitive thinking, they've got a rigid style of thinking. So that's kind of the personality factor that is more linked to obedience. You can see that. And it's thought that this is linked back to childhood and early experiences. So you can imagine someone who's got that sort of thinking style, well, their childhood is probably quite likely to promote that. So someone with an authoritarian personality, their parents probably again believe in this hierarchy. The parent should be listened to, the child not. They're probably treated quite harshly. This is right, this is wrong. They're probably quite repressed. They're not allowed to show their own views and feelings and emotion because things have to be very conventional, and they might have this kind of hostility and these feelings of resentment kind of resurface later in life, and they then project these problems that they've had as a child onto other areas. So non-threatening groups, minority groups, they don't like groups of others, and so that's kind of this or authoritarian personality coming from early childhood. Another area that kind of links to this is Adorno, and something called the S scale. So the S scale stands for the fascism scale. So fascism again believes in hierarchy, it believes in right and wrong, it believes in being very strict and kind of quite narrow and black and white thinking, and so the S scale, the fascism scale, measures attitudes to do with authoritarian personality. So someone who scores highly on the S scale is more likely to have a authoritarian personality. There was some research that showed that those on the S scale got a stronger score, were more likely to show obedience in Milgram study, but that has been disputed. It's not always found. Sometimes it has been found, sometimes it hasn't, but these are all linked. So these are all dispositional factors that are linked to whether someone's likely to obey or not. Okay, and a bit of evaluation there for the dispositional explanations of obedience. Again, unfortunately, they're all weaknesses. So to begin with, yeah, the F scale is not a good scale. It's not a good study of, not a good way to assess authoritarian personality. It's got what's known as a response bias. So just by responding and going through the questionnaire, you're likely to be put on the S scale at some point anywhere. So it means just because you're responding, you're going to get a high score. So the validity of the S scale has certainly been questioned. The results are also what we know as correlational. So high score on the F scale, high score on authoritarian personality. Doesn't mean one is causing the other. And it could be that a third variable, how they were educated, their childhood, as we've mentioned, could be impacting both. So you would question that as well. And again, we've got this, is the dispositional explanation of obedience a good one? Well, there's some merit in it, but to say that it's just personality factors, well, there are lots of people do obey, and to suggest they've all got the same sort of personality style and had this really strict upbringing doesn't quite sit right. So again, think about Nazi Germany. Not all of those who obeyed will have had this really strict upbringing, and so you would question it on those grounds. Okay, the third area of the social topic is pro-social behaviour. So we've looked at why people act similar to others in a group. We looked at why people do or don't listen to orders by others. So pro-social behaviour is why do they act well in groups or in society. So this is the next named study. So it's the Piliavin study, and this is the Subway study. So it was to test what's known as bystander behaviour. This came out of a case in New York, Kitty Genovese, where it was reported a lady was attacked in the street, and 34 people saw her. The attacker went away and came back, and no one called anything or did anything, and people were really shocked by this and said, well, why was that? And the people were interviewed afterwards, and they said, oh, well, I saw other people were seeing as well, and I thought they were going to do something. So this was known as kind of diffusion of responsibility. Other people thought other people were doing things and they weren't, known as the bystander effect. Why do people watch? So Piliavin wanted to test this, and and tested this using a field experiment. So went into New York onto the subway and looked at whether in this natural setting people would help other people or not. Tested the bystander effect. Was this consistent with what they saw with Kitty Genovese? How it happened, so there were 4 people on each subway carriage. They all worked for the experimenter. 2 of them were kind of actors, Confederates, and the other 2 were recording the data. And so they made 103 different subway journeys, and the actors were then acting one of 2 roles. They were either playing a drunk person, or they were playing someone who was blind, or someone had, they called it having a disability. And what they did is they played the victim, they stood at a pole, and then they fell over and collapsed, and they wanted to see whether other people on the carriage helped. So yeah, 38 times they were acting drunk, they smelled of alcohol, they had a bottle. 65 times they were carrying cane. Otherwise it was the same person, they looked very similar. Again, that was a control. And the other 2 researchers were watching what they did. The second actor then went to help if someone hadn't helped after 70 seconds. So that was another thing. Did people help once someone else had stepped in, or were they helping individually? This is what they found. So they found that only 50% of the time the drunk person was helped, and even fewer they were helped when a model wasn't there to show. So only 17% of the time the drunk person was helped within the first 70 seconds. They were helped more, obviously up to 50% of the time, when someone else modelled prosocial behaviour. Whereas for the blind person, the blind man, the disabled person, 95% of the time they were helped, and most of that time it was helped within the first 70 seconds. The researchers were recording the number of people on the carriage. The theory going into the study was that the more people were there, the fewer people would help, because there was bigger diffusion of responsibility. They actually found that didn't have an impact. The number of people on the carriage, whether there were lots, whether there were few, didn't seem to affect the helping behaviour at all. And yeah, so it was an average of about 43 people on the train. So what can we get from this? So it does look like the victim characteristics. So there was a big difference between the blind person and the drunk person. So victim characteristics did seem to have an impact on prosocial behaviour, whether people helped other people or not. And this was explained as whether they're deserving or not. So someone who was disabled, obviously they've not done anything wrong, and so people will be helping them. Whereas someone who's drunk, maybe they're less deserving of help. But actually, interestingly, happily for society, people in an emergency do seem to help, and it didn't seem to impact the number of people that were there. So in evaluating Pliavin then, one of the strengths is that both quantitative and qualitative data were collected. So we've already looked at the statistics on the previous slide, but the researchers also asked the participants, why did you help, why didn't you help? And so got some qualitative data as well. So it's quite rich, detailed information there. What was also good, lots of the research that we look at, lots of the named studies are lab experiments. They're quite highly controlled. This was a field experiment, so it happened in a more naturalistic setting. There were still some controls. Obviously, it was the same victim. They dressed and looked the same, other than being drunk or being disabled. But it was quite nice that this was in a natural environment, more realistic, and therefore maybe the validity is better there. However, we can't apply this everywhere. Obviously, it was still in America, it's still in New York, and so does this apply to other areas at other times? We would need further research to back that up. Okay, so like the other areas, we need to look at the social factors, the environment, and the dispositional factors that influence prosocial behaviour. So firstly, yeah, presence of others is a big one. Already mentioned Kitty Genovese, Darley and Latane were the ones that researched that afterwards. They've also conducted another study here. So this was one where they had participants in a room, and they were either alone or with other people, and they heard someone over the intercom needing help, they're having a seizure, and they looked at whether they intervened and whether they helped or not. And what they found was that people were more likely to help if they were on their own compared to when there were other people. So this suggests that the presence of others does impact it, actually you're more likely to get help if there are fewer people there because of this diffusion of responsibility. If it's just you, you feel the responsibilities on you, whereas if there's others, you think other people should be doing things, bystander effect. But that's not always the case. Again, Pili-Arvin didn't find that. Pili-Arvin found that in the subway study, people, it didn't matter how many people were there. Fau et al. Found that people helped in real life serious emergencies regardless of how many people are there. So you can question whether the presence of others has an impact, but it's certainly something to discuss. What else then? Cost of helping. So we talk about the cost of helping. So, you know, you could potentially be putting yourself in danger if you're helping. There's effort, there's time, there's embarrassment. You know, people might not have helped in the Pili-Arvin study because they were scared of what the drunk person might do to them. There's also the cost of not helping. So what, you know, you go away and you feel like you haven't helped someone who is blind or even drunk. You know, what impact might that have on you? And there might be cost benefit analysis here, rewards for helping. You might feel good about yourself for helping other than not. And so, yeah, there are lots of things to bear in mind here. And so these things can all impact pro-social behaviour in the real world. There are also dispositional factors, so things about the individual that could impact pro-social behaviour or not. So the first is similarity to the victim. So if you are more similar to a victim, you're more likely to help them. They did find this a slight effect here in Pili-Arvin study. So the white participants were more likely to help white victims than others. So that's interesting. And Levine et al. Did another study, I really like this one, study looking at football supporters, and they had a group of Man United fans, and they then made it so that they saw either another Man United fan, so they all had shirts on, Man U shirts, another Man United fan collapsed outside, or someone in a Liverpool shirt. So if the United fans saw someone in a Liverpool shirt collapsed outside, they walked on by, might have spat on them, might have kicked them a bit, whereas if they saw someone with another United shirt on, they went and helped them. So we're more likely to help someone who's similar to us. However, what's interesting, what I quite liked, this is a nicer part of society, when they were together and they were given a talk saying, oh, we're all football fans, we're all part of the same family, we should help each other, that actually improved pro-social behaviour. So even if they were wearing a Liverpool shirt, if they had heard before, actually we should help each other, that did help there. And the other evaluation is that you see lots of examples of pro-social behaviour when people aren't similar to other people anyway. So how much of an effect does similarity have? Maybe it's quite small. We've mentioned expertise previously, but expertise can have an impact on pro-social behaviour too. So if you have seen someone collapse in the street and you've just done a first aid course, you might be more likely to help because you think, oh, actually, I know something. Whereas if you see, I don't know, an electrical power station blowing up and you're not an electrician, you might think, oh, I'm going to leave that to someone else. And so, yeah, skills, expertise, the individual themselves has an impact on helping behaviour, pro-social behaviour. There is people that have contradicted this. So yeah, those with Red Cross training who have got first aid training know more or less likely to help. It has been found, but there's likely to be some sort of impact on expertise on pro-social behaviour. Last but not least, crowd and collective behaviour. So how does being in a crowd, how does being in a group impact our behaviour? So Gustave Le Bon, great name, suggested that anonymity might change people's behaviour. So if you're in a crowd, if you're wearing, again, think of a football crowd or just a group and you're wearing very similar things, think of a riot. Don't know how many of you have been in riots, but hey ho. Then you might just act the way that, or you might act in a way that you don't usually act in because you think you're anonymous, you think no one can identify you, and so you change the way you act and behave. So it might lead to antisocial behaviour. Yeah, good old Le Bon, he was quite negative about how people act in groups. So yeah, he says that in normal society, social norms dictate how people behave and why they behave correctly. But if you're in a group, if you're in a crowd, then you lose those restraints. You haven't got those social norms, and so you might act differently. You might behave impulsively, antisocially. You might be spray painting, doing all those things. There's another aspect here called de-individuation. So this is where a person loses their sense of identity, which can happen in the crowd as well. So if you're wearing your own clothes and you are who you are, you're showing your own individual characteristics, then you identify as yourself. Whereas if you're in a uniform or a football kit, or this happened in the Zimbabwe prison experiment where the prisoners and the prison guards wore particular uniforms, they were what's known as de-individualized. So they might have acted in different ways. So that was Zimbardo's study. They wore sunglasses, they wore uniforms, so they might not act how they would usually act. And Zimbardo also redid a version of the Milgram study, and had people wearing different clothes, wearing things that aren't the same, and they found that people gave longer shocks, and so acted in a different way. So all these things can affect crowd and collective behaviour. Not much space for my little face in these evaluations, is there? Where am I going to put myself here? Okay, so a few evaluative points then. So there is a strength here. So research can, if we know about this, it can help us to create more pro-social behaviour in crowd and collective behaviour. So for example, they sometimes show crowds, football crowds, rugby crowds, sports crowds, CCTV images of themselves, so they can see themselves there. So they think, oh, maybe I'm not anonymous, and it reminds them of who they are, and so that could make them act a bit better in group behaviour. De-individuation doesn't always result in antisocial behaviour, and this was tested by Johnson and Downing. They gave people, again, Milgram type study, dressed them in antisocial norm uniforms, KKK uniforms, pro-social like nurses or their own clothes, and they found different levels of crowd and collective and pro-social behaviour here. So there's a question of whether de-individuation does actually impact how people act. And actually, there's another theory of why people do act poorly in crowds, and that's actually just being in a crowd. It's not very nice. You could get pushed around. It's hot. It's sweaty. You can't get what you want. And so actually, it's the fact of being in a crowd that is changing people's behaviour rather than being de-individuated and losing a sense of social norms, as has been suggested. Okay, and we'll finish then looking at the social and dispositional factors for crowd and collective behaviours. You kind of get how it works now. So first off, social behaviours. What is it about the environment of being in a crowd, being with lots of other people, that changes our behaviour? One of the key theories here is known as social loafing. So this is how where people are in a group tend to put in less effort than when they're on their own, and that happens. You might have had experience of that if you've ever been put in a group project. You will find that there are people that just don't pull their weight. If you don't think you found that, it's probably you, so please do the work. And this has been studied. So Ringelmann tested this, and they were asking people to pull on a rope, and they either did that on an individual basis or with a group. And what they found is when they did it in a group, people putting in less individual effort than when they did it on their own. Two explanations for this. One, it's quite hard to coordinate with other people, so you lose some of that individual spark. Okay, get that. But two is reduced effort. People think that other people are doing the work and so don't put in the work themselves. Could be down to de-individuation, but Latane again has tested this. So they got people to shout or sing when they're on their own, and then did it with one other person or with a group of 6. And what they found was that when they were on their own, they made the most noise. When there were then 2, they made a little bit less, and when there were 6, there were fewer still. So again, it's this kind of either coordination effort or people are just genuinely putting in less effort. And so social loafing certainly has an impact on collective and group behaviour. However, it has been found that it's not always a negative thing. So having more people in a group can be good for kind of coming up with new ideas, brainstorming, working together can be helpful, but it will depend on the task. And also culture will have an impact. So we mentioned individualistic and collectivist cultures before. So individualistic culture, Western, think of UK, United States, Australia, etc. Or collectivist, so more kind of Asian, Eastern, China, Korea. And again, they tested group behavior in these different cultures. So they gave US and Chinese participants a couple of tasks to do. In one of the tasks, the individual was identifiable, and in the other task, the individual was less identifiable. What they found was the Chinese participants put in exactly the same amount of effort whether they were identifiable or not, whereas the American participants put in more effort when they were on their own and less effort when they were with others. And that suggests that, again, this kind of collective behavior, people are changing how they act in groups. Obviously, that's quite generalizable. It doesn't mean all Americans put in less effort and all Chinese don't, but it gives you an indication of one of the aspects that can impact crowd and collective behavior. And then dispositional factors. So what is it about the individual? So we've mentioned locus of control before, and again, you can maybe then see how this can be applied to crowd and collective behaviors. So those with an internal locus of control are probably, so they believe that they're responsible for their own actions. They're going to be less influenced by crowd and collective behavior, whereas those with an external locus of control, they think that things happen to them and the outside world happens to them more, they're going to be more influenced by a crowd. And so that potentially is going to have an impact. Some research has found that it doesn't have any impact, but it's something certainly to be aware of. And then last but not least, morality. So just a belief in what is right or wrong. And some people have a high level of morality, high idea of what is right, what is wrong, high moral strength. So they'll put their ideas and their morals above maybe even their own safety. Other people that don't have. And so those with a high morality might have be less influenced by crowd behavior. They'll do what they think is right, whereas those with less of moral strength might be more influenced by the group. And so an example here is people, again, I keep going back to Nazi Germany, but these crowd and social impacts can be shown there, but there are individuals there. So you've got Sophie Scholl, who was distributed anti-Nazi literature because she just thought the Nazis were doing things that were morally incomprehensible, and she was so strong in her morals that she thought she had to do something. She knew the danger there, and she was actually executed for it. But it shows, it's a good real life example of how morality can have an impact on how people act in groups. Hope you found the video useful. Hope it helps with the research, revision, and good luck in assessments. Peace out.